and wide to the 15th interview in the University of Buckingham series. And the series is Great Lives, Great Minds. And tonight we have one of the most thoughtful, insightful, compassionate figures who specializes in bereavement and helping people. Julia and I first met when my own wife died 3.5 years ago. And I think, Julia, you asked me to give a podcast, but I'd long admired you and your work and been very aware of you in my own work in happiness and well-being. So just a few things before we begin. I'd love, and Julia would love, to have your questions. So do please send the questions in to us, and it should be quite obvious how to do it. If they're short questions, that's definitely a benefit. And if you'd like to put your name there, that's always a nice personal touch. And I'll be moving towards your questions and putting them in as and when. If you've enjoyed the series, do share the list of speakers with your friends. It's good to have as many as possible. I think we're going to have over 1,000 tonight. Julia was just saying that in literary festivals, it's unusual to have more than 300. For media, it's unusual to have more than 3. And my mum is one of those. But over 1,000 tonight. And Julia, tell us about your how did this glittering, hugely influential career start? Were you bedazzling at school?
I really wasn't bedazzling at school. I left school at 16. I was always a grafter at school, and I kind of followed the rules. But I mean, I took my A-levels at 16, so I left early. And I loved English and I loved history, but I always thought I was stupid. And
why did you think you were stupid? Who put that notion in your mind?
I had one wonderful teacher, Mrs. Coleman, at my first school, at my primary school, who gave me that book about dogs that got lost. I can't even remember what it's called. So she gave me a little spark that I had a brain, but from then on, no one was sort of particularly interested in me or noticed me, or, you know, the only prize I ever won was the diving cup when I was 9. So that's how dazzling my school career was. I think also I was the youngest child of 5 children born within 4 years. So I have a twin brother and I have 2 twin sisters and a sister in the middle. So I think, you know, from a very young age, I was always kind of running to catch up and a bit behind everybody else. And I think I've always felt that sort of in me ever since. And the benefit of that is that I am a grafter. So I always work hard. I do my homework. I read the stuff I meant to read because I'm terrified of making a fool of myself and being sort of caught out.
And tell us about the room that you're in. One of the joys over a literary festival, and by the way, do check out the Buckingham Literary Festival, of which this is a part. One of the joys is that we can come into the room of the writer and thinker. Julia, tell us about the room.
So this is our kind of study TV room. And my husband has a desk in here and I have a desk in here. And over lockdown, I recorded quite a lot of podcasts and webinars, and he creeps in and blows his nose really loudly or forgets that I'm doing something. So then everybody hears me shouting at him or swearing at him. But it's a room that I kind of drop my shoulders and relax when I walk in here, because it feels very familiar. It's quite an enclosed space. It has a fire which I light until it's really too hot to light anymore, because I love a kind of burning fire. And I think a lot in here. I write in the sitting room, so I write in a room with just my laptop on my lap, sitting on a sofa. I was writing today. I'm writing a new book, and so I don't have a kind of special room I go to write. I sit in the sitting room. It's the nicest room. It's got the most light.
And you're writing on the laptop rather than in longhand?
Yes.
Always?
I write notes. So I do lots of, so I've literally just started this new book. So I do reading. I think a lot of my writing happens when I'm on a bicycle or walking. So a lot of it happens off the page, or I wake up in the morning, and in bed I think quite a lot. And then I do write notes into my phone, into that note section of the phone, or into a notebook. And then that eventually gets into the book.
So we'll come on to the books.
You never stop writing a book, do you? You've always got a book on the go. You've written more books than it's possible to write.
They just happen, don't they? And
No.
without you realizing it, they creep up on you. They almost have their own life and their own personhood. And if I was
to, work than that, don't you think?
Sorry.
They're quite a bit more work than that. I mean,
oh my goodness. Well, I've never had a baby. I'm a bloke, but Joanna always used to say that having a baby was extremely painful, but miraculously you forget about it, and that's certainly true of writing books. And I, at different points, would have to get up at 4 in the morning after 4 or 5 hours sleep to get into that routine, because I've always had another job, and I would edge myself to the side of the bed and then fall out deliberately, because hitting the floor would be that shock that I'd need to get up. And you just push yourself very, very hard. And whether that's going to result in early onset dementia, as some people say, because of lack of sleep, I don't know. But the point is that you forget. But the point is, we're not talking about me, Julia. I want to talk about you being in the room with your husband. That's quite unusual, having a desk with your husband in the room. Does that work well?
It does work well. I mean, it does work well. We both work from home now, so lockdown for us, I mean, of course we haven't seen people and we haven't had meetings and things, but lockdown hasn't been as big a shock for us as it has for other people, because I see clients at home and I've seen them online. He works from home, so yeah, it works okay. Just to go back to the writing, when I launched this last book, This Too Shall Pass, I said that a book is like having the third person in the marriage, because if we're going on walks and he ever asks me what am I thinking about, it's always my book. I wake up thinking about my book, I go to sleep thinking about my book. It's sort of like a boyfriend that sometimes you really hate because it's not giving you what you want, and there are little moments of pleasure where you think, ha, I did 1,500 words today, and you're quite pleased with your boyfriend. And it's a relationship, that's for sure.
I was just going to say, this loud sneezing would seem to be evidence of the behaviour of a jealous male. What's it like for him having such a celebrated wife? And do you pick up any jealousy, or are you going to deny there's jealousy on his part? He's
not jealous. I think what's quite annoying for him is that because I do a job that is supporting other people, it makes out that I am much nicer than I really am, and he knows what I'm really like. So when people come up to him and say, you know, your wife's so marvellous, she does such marvellous things, there's a lot of him that wants to say, well, she was a complete cow on the way here and she was awful this morning, but he can't, because that makes him look bad. So he has to swallow how awful I've been and pretend that he thinks I'm as nice as they think I am, which I obviously am not.
By the way, it's jolly odd, everybody looking in, to be talking to a therapist and asking the therapist questions, because all the time I'm feeling the questions are kind of coming back to me. But I'm going to ask, what do you mean when you say your real self, and whether you're really very nice? And do you actually believe that?
If you talk about a kind of real self, from a therapeutic point of view, I think we have multiple selves that sort of come out in different places and with different people. So, I mean, with me, I do think the part of myself that in a way I'm most proud of, and I think is most powerful, is the one as a therapist, where I put my own needs, my own kind of ego aside, and attune and listen to and support the person in front of me, trying to understand the world from their perspective.
So who was Julia Samuel before she became a therapist?
So I started training when I was, so I got married at 20. I've been married 40 years. Before I was a therapist, I think to begin with, I had put on a lot of front. So I kind of made, I was much more confident than I was. I was always good with people. I've always liked people. I've always wanted, my big driver my entire life, which is true from when I was a young child to now, is that I have always been more interested in what's going on inside other people than what they look like or what they're saying. And so that I've always had. So I was going to say a therapist. I was a decorator, interior decorator. I first worked in publishing and then I worked in interior decoration. And as a decorator, you're more or less a therapist, dealing with a husband and wife or partners who fight about pink and blue. And that, in a way, sort of cued me into knowing that I was good at working with people. I was good with people. So that's what I've always been good at. But I am much more confident now. I'm much more, I know myself much better. I'm much more aware of all my fault lines. So I don't have to hide them quite so much.
I'm not quite understanding the segue between, not the most natural one, between interior decoration and training to become a therapist. What happened? Who pushed you in that direction, if anybody did?
There were quite a lot of life events that happened. So I went with a friend to an AA meeting, and I was completely blown away by people talking about what they felt. So they were, all my life I was brought up in a world where everyone said they're fine, but they clearly weren't fine. But they always said they were okay. And if you said to someone, "Are you angry?" "No, I'm not angry." And so that's the only way I knew how people kind of operated, was pretending everything was all right. And so going to an AA meeting and hearing people talk from the heart and openly and truthfully about all their different complexities and mistakes they'd made was an absolute revelation. And I was blown away by it. And that's what got me into being a therapist, the first step of it. There were many steps to it. I volunteered first for ages. And then...
So why did you go to the Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, and what precisely was it that triggered this thought?
I am not going to have a therapy session with you, but it was, I went with someone who I was close to, who had addiction problems.
And is one ever cured of alcoholism? What's the process of healing there? How does that work?
I mean, so people, you probably know this, and most people listening, is that I think you're always an addict, but you're what they call you're a recovering addict. And so you do the 12-step program, and you kind of recognize that you're powerless against your particular addiction, whether it's gambling, sex, drugs, alcohol, whatever your addiction is. And that what I've understood about addiction is normally it's the anesthetic to try and block the pain that's beneath it, that there are a lot of painful, difficult things that you don't want to look at. And either behaviorally from what you have observed around you, and probably some predisposition, genetic predisposition, you choose alcohol to block them out, to block out what's too difficult to deal with. And then, of course, it creates many more problems than the ones that you're blocking out. So it's a very kind of negative cycle people get into.
And in the steps, the 12 steps, there is appealing to a higher power. What's your understanding of that, Julia? Because as I understand about you, you reject God in your own life. What therefore is space could there be for a higher power if it's not God?
So I don't know that I reject God as such. I mean, I was brought up CV, so I went to church all the time as a child, CV, and I love church. I love ritual. I'm married to a Jew, so I go to synagogue with him. And I think there's a sense of belonging that spirituality and religion can bring through church, through synagogue, through a mosque, which I think is incredibly important for us individually to be part of something that's bigger than ourselves. And I think to believe in a higher power, I mean, most people, whether they believe in organized religion or not, when something goes wrong, they pray to a God or Gaia or a spirit, because it's so lonely being so frightened and powerless. And so most people pray. And I'm sort of one of those people. I get a lot from, you know, kind of the universe and nature, and actually from organized religion too, but not one particular one.
So coming through your own journey with training as a therapist, Julia, by the way, I also married somebody who was Jewish. I think that came up in our podcast together. And
Julia Neuberger is our rabbi. She married us.
And she presided over the memorial. So tell us more about how you, what training, how do you train to be a therapist? How does that work? And when did you decide to specialize as you have?
So the training is both practice and theory. So you always have to kind of do a volunteer post to practice your profession. So I started off working in a drop-in centre in the Harrow Road with Mind, and then I worked with Agoraphobics, and then I decided to do some sort of formalised training. And so that's where you look at different models of therapy, whether it's cognitive behavioural therapy, which is the one that's best evidence-based, or humanistic, which is what I am, or analytic. And most of the training is about 4 or 5 years. And you learn experience in the way that I trained it. You learn theories, but you also learn experientially. So you learn by being in a group and you talk about yourself and people give you feedback, and you become much more aware of what's going on inside you than you were before. So you're kind of, the point of the training is that you know yourself well enough to be able to know what's happening from the, so we're all, like you and I talking, although it's across a screen, we affect each other. I will trigger responses in you and me. Me being asked questions is by far my least favorite thing, by the way.
You're doing very well at it.
I didn't know it was going to be a therapy session. So the work of the training is that you know what is likely to be ignited by clients, so that you don't act out and damage them, that you work in their best interest because you know what's going on in you, and that you can put that to one side and kind of work with what they're bringing, and also have a cognitive capacity to understand it as they're speaking from their perspective, to be empathic.
So is a humanist therapist like a mirror? Are you holding the mirror up to the client so they understand themselves better?
It is a bit that. So the difference between, so the cognitive behavioural is that what I think affects how I feel, and that affects how I behave. So what I'm telling myself will affect my behaviour. Analytic is the more conscious you make your unconscious by being the therapist being a mirror and giving you interpretations that you then deal with your sort of difficulties. Humanistic is much more about trusting the client and the relationship, that if you are empathic, if you're authentic, and if you don't judge them, you give them what they need for themselves and they begin to trust themselves, and that is the agent of change.
The enhancement of trust on the part. And why grief? How were you attracted towards that as your particular specialism?
I mean, there was the very external things, which was that I became chairman of a charity which was then called Birthright, which was supporting families where babies died. And I hadn't, I'd had 4 children by then, and I hadn't really been aware of how devastating it was that a baby died. But also, both my parents, my mum, by the time she was 25, her mother, her father, her sister, and her brother had all died. And my dad, by the time he was the same age, his father and his brother had died. And kind of looking back at it now, we were brought up in a house that was a happy house, but there were these black and white photographs of all these very significant people who were never talked about. I didn't know anything about them. I knew their names. I knew probably a strapline about each of them. But I think unconsciously that had an effect on me around grief, that there was a lot of unexpressed, unresolved grief in my parents, which, they didn't have a choice. They didn't kind of really recognize it. And also they were fighting a war they had to get on.
So can you explain why and how talking about those who have departed can be healing? I've often found that people haven't wanted to ask me about Joanna because they thought perhaps it would upset me, which on one level it does, but on another level, it's very nice to talk about her, and our 3 children find the same. How does that work? Suppressing talking about them to actually talking about them being helpful?
So as we understand it now, the process of grieving is a natural and an adaptive process, where the work is to adapt to this new reality that you don't want and you didn't choose. And pain is the agent of change. So while everything is comfortable and we're secure in ourselves, we have no requirement or demand on us to change. But the signals of pain, of discomfort at one end and extreme pain at the other, force us to kind of recognize something. We have to look at something, we have to face something. And when we don't voice it at all, I mean, talking isn't by any means the only way of expressing it, but it's the one most commonly done. When you put words with your feelings and you voice them and they're heard and received, it incrementally adjusts to this new reality, to the fact that the person that you love has died. And every time you do that, you move a little bit more to adapting to that reality. Does that make sense?
It does. It does, and I'm sure it will to the huge numbers listening to this who will be benefiting, as I am, enormously from your words. Do, by the way, have questions. Quite a few are beginning to come in now. Please do ask questions. And Julia, the sense that you wanted then, as well as having individual patients, you wanted to write for a wider audience, and the publication of Grief Works, great title. How long was that bubbling away in your mind for?
It wasn't really, because I always thought I was stupid. I also always thought that I had nothing to say. And that whatever had been written about grief had been already said. But then I went on Desert Island Discs, and an agent heard me, and out of the blue she wrote to me and said, I'm sure lots of people have asked you to write books. Would you think about it? And I wrote back and said, no one has ever asked me. And it's like homework forever, writing a book. I'm just not sure I can face it. And she's called Felicity Rubinstein, and she was really clever because she never put me under pressure. But after about 3 coffees, she said, listen, why don't you just do a proposal? That's only 20,000 words. If it doesn't get published, no big deal. And if it does, then you know it's worth doing it. And so I didn't do it for like 4 months. And then literally I woke up one morning and I thought I will be so cross when I'm 80. And I had someone who said, write a book, and I didn't dare do it because I was too scared. I couldn't do it. So over that summer, I got up at about 4:30 in the morning because it was summer holidays and I was with my children. And I wrote for about 2 hours every day through the month of August. And I did the proposal and I published the book. Can I say 2 more things about grief though? Because I didn't really finish.
Yeah.
So in adjusting to the reality and feeling and expressing the pain, what we know now is very different. So my parents' generation very much thought that you forget and move on, and that you move forward and you don't think about the person that's died. You sort of close the door on them. And what we know now is that the relationship doesn't die, the love goes on forever. And what they talk about is continuing bonds, so that you continue that the person has died and you face the pain of that and feel the pain of that and adjust and find a way of living again and engaging life again, having done that. But the relationship continues, and you do that through touchstones to memory. So it may be talking about Joanna, it may be going for a walk with someone through a walk we always did with her, or eating her chicken casserole that she made, or wearing something of hers, or looking at a picture. And that we move, with clients, I talk about it as front of mind and back of mind, that sometimes you choose for the person 20 years, 10 years, 5 years, 2 years later, to kind of focus on them and remember them and connect to them. And then other times you choose to let them to go to the back of the mind, knowing that you can always bring them forward. So they remain part of you and influence you and shape your life as you go forward, although they're not physically present.
Are there other things you want to say about that? It's so important. I have a sense that there's an enormous audience out there who are really reflecting on what you're saying, Julia.
The biggest single predictor of getting through grief is the love and connection to others. Is that when someone you love has died, it's the love of others that really supports you. So that when you're at your lowest, it can often be that you feel so low, you don't want to turn to other people. And also there's a kind of painful companion of grief, which is guilt, that you sort of feel that you shouldn't, or you self-attack. And the big thing I would encourage anyone listening or anyone grieving is to kind of be self-compassionate, like choose to support yourself and let people into your life to support you. And that wouldn't always be talking about the person, but being connected to other people. It's so lonely grieving. It really helps you. And that's why during the time of Corona, it's been unbelievably difficult for people, because the one thing that really helps them, they haven't been able to have.
I'm going to bring a quick question from Sophie there, who says, "Hi, Julia. During the COVID crisis, I lost a family member and wasn't able to be with them during their final hours. What can you advise to help cope with the painful, particular added pain of this?"
I'm really sorry, Sophie. That is a real added pain, because one of the kind of difficulties is how someone dies, and that if you're with them and can say goodbye to them and hold their hand, that is a much better death that you can kind of remember than one that is distant. And I don't know whether you saw the person on a screen or whether you had no image at all. I think what could support you is, I mean, now that lockdown is becoming unlocked, I would meet up with people and talk about the person, but also maybe think about having some kind of ritual, whether you, with a few other people, whether you light a candle and say some poems or prayers, that you need to do things that help you acknowledge and face the reality of it, because I'm sure it feels both devastating but also surreal. So anything that helps make it feel tangible, I think, would really help you.
And Mary asks similarly, do you have any tips, Julia, for people to manage their anxiety and grief during and after COVID?
So fear and anxiety, you feel it in your body, and grief does feel like fear. And one of the simple, most effective things that you can do is exercise, because your body, in the shock of the grief and the anxiety, it goes on alert, it goes in fight, flight or freeze, and kind of looking for danger. And so if you take exercise, and that just means going out for half an hour or 20 minutes, getting your heart rate up. It doesn't mean you have to do a marathon or anything kind of hugely difficult, but just being outside is much better than inside. Although if you can't get outside, you can do it, with someone on the television. But moving your body for sort of 20 minutes, half an hour, 40 minutes, it drops the cortisol levels, which are the anxiety hormones, and increases the dopamine, which calms you down. And then your whole system is more regulated. But also that means that your capacity to think goes online, because when you're in a heightened alert state, your capacity to think goes offline because you're just there looking for the tiger, knowing whether to run or fight. So once you're, so everything, if you think when you're grieving or in life, everything that you do has effect on your system. So what you watch, what you read, what you eat, what you drink, how you move or don't move your body. So the more things you do that are kind of stabilizing and reducing it being heightened, that really supports you, and it does lower the level of anxiety and grief. Not grief, because the grief needs to be there, but the fear in your body. And NICE guidelines, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, show that regular exercise is the equivalent of antidepressants. So it really makes a difference. And if you do a double combination of you exercise and you do, I mean, Anthony will tell you more about this than I do, but even if you do a 5 or 10 minute breathing exercise to calm your system after the exercise, where you can breathe in for the count of 7 and out for the count of 11, something as simple as that, although Anthony, I'm sure, does something much more meaningful, that again calms you down. And then that builds your resilience to deal with the waves of loss that come through and hit your body. And that's what you need to do, is that you need to build yourself up so that you can surf the pain.
Let's come back just to Grief Works, that first book, and what overall you felt that had said, and then why you then came on to This Too Shall Pass, the second.
So, I mean, what I wanted it, I felt that although everybody kind of at one level knows that they're going to grieve and that they're going to die, there is a kind of magical thinking that we don't talk about it and we don't want to think about it, and that if you do, that somehow it's going to make it happen. And all the clients in the 30 years that I was working, they'd come through the door and somehow they'd think that they were doing grief wrong because it was so painful. So the first thing I wanted to do was to let them know that what they're feeling, as mad as they may feel, that that's normal and that this is a normal process, and that the other thing is that they need to support themselves in it, that the things they do to avoid it and block it are often the things that do them harm over time. And then through the case study, so I talked about different clients I'd had through different relationships, through a parent dying, a partner dying, a sibling dying, a child dying, and facing their own death. I showed that the most personal is the most universal, that people had very idiosyncratic and unique stories, but often people will say to me, having read the book, that they saw themselves in many of the stories, even if they were a different gender and it was a different loss, that they connected with it because it felt so personal and felt so true, which it was.
And then that second title, This Too Shall Pass. What is passing there, Julia?
That whatever we're feeling in this moment, however bad it is, that it goes too, that life is change, that the one thing that we're certain of, as well as death, is that life is change. And that, again, if we think we have control over change, we are kidding ourselves. And if we think we can block it, again, the things that we do to block it are the things that do us harm. And the research is very robust, is that the more we're able to adapt and go with the change, however much we resist it, or however much we don't want it, we have more joy and more success in life.
And a couple of short questions, lighter ones. What was your, on Desert Island Disc, what was your luxury in book?
My luxury was a notepad and pen to journal and write to my family. And my book was a volume of poems.
Any particular author or a collection?
Well, it was a selection. Do you know, my mind has gone completely blank. I could see it in the back of my head and I can't make it come forward now.
It'll come back to you. And then a question: someone would like to know if they could become a godparent to Prince George. Also, how do you become a godparent, Julia, to the future king? Yeah, Prince George.
Through friendship. It's through friendship. Friends matter. People matter. And being real friends is how we create things like have godparents for our children. But I think particularly in the times like now, it's when we need friends and family more than ever. I think a lot of people have realized in COVID that relationships matter almost more than everything else. When everything else is so turbulent, you want to be able to hold on and rely on the sort of true friendships.
And for the princes, Will and Harry, how was their own mental health and their bereavement in a family not renowned for the openness of admission of inner feelings? And did you play any role in their own grief management? Or maybe it's confidential, in which case please don't, obviously.
I think they're much better at talking. I mean, they've been very good at talking about their grief and their mental health, and there's lots of places anyone could find an answer to that question where they've done interviews and articles, and so it's much better if you go to the direct source than me.
They have, Harry, I mean, they have done very well, haven't they? And they've done more than anybody, both of them, to make it okay for young people to talk about their feelings, precisely as you were saying about the Alcoholics Anonymous, and that realization that it's like it's a change of language almost. And Dan is asking, Julia, if you weren't doing what you're doing now, what would you most like to have done instead? There you are.
Well, just to answer your question with William and Harry, I think they really turned the dial with the work that they did and their honesty. And actually, I said to them, you know, I've been slogging at this for by then it was, I think, 25 years. And I honestly don't think I helped start a charity and slogged away. And I spoke at conferences all over places, all over the world and the UK. And I don't think I made much difference. And you two kind of do 2 interviews and set up a charity, and the whole thing kind of shifts. And there was many more. All the men's websites and counselling was, I mean, because where they've really had an impact is young men seeking support and recognising their mental health. And so I feel incredibly proud of them for that. And, you know, they've really changed something. They've really made a big contribution. If I hadn't been a therapist, I think I might. I always like houses and property, so I would have gone back to decorating in some way. If I could ever have done it, I'd probably done property development. And I think in a way it's the opposite of counselling. So everything about therapy is invisible. You can't see the impact you've had. You can't really see what someone's feeling, and you're left carrying it and thinking about it. Whereas decorating and building houses is completely visual, and you can totally being not in control entirely, but you know, it's pretty reliable. If you want a pink room and you like that pink, you can make it pink, which most of life you have very little control over. So that's why I like it.
And Julia, do males find it, do they in fact find it harder to be open about their feelings? And if that is true of the male, why is that the case?
I think you'd be much better to answer that question, Anthony, than me, being of the male species.
Well, I think that there's an expectation that we don't talk. When I'm with my male friends, we talk about objects more and practical things and politics and the economy and ideas, or cars or sport. It tends to be about things out there rather than things in there. But I don't know, Julia, why that is the case and whether that is a genetic thing about maleness, or whether that's a conditioning thing. I don't know.
I think two things. I think I've had quite a lot of clients, young men who are clients, and I think men sort of under 45 are different to you and me. I think they're much more open with their feelings. I think they're much more emotionally intelligent. Most millennials are much more emotionally aware, emotionally intelligent, and have been brought up very differently from how we were brought up. Millennials have had more parenting than any other generation in history before them, so they are, are much better at expressing their feelings and knowing what they're feeling. And I think that's as true of men and women. I think a lot of it is environmental, how you're brought up. Big boys don't cry and then let the little girl cry, or wear pink and blue. In grief, what the research shows, and again, I don't know whether this is behavioural or whether it's genetic, is that the two pulls in grief, processing grief, is loss orientation and restoration orientation, that you need to move between the two, that you allow yourself to emotionally feel the pain and you oscillate to being restorative, where you get on with life, you have hope for the future and you move forward and you allow yourself to do both. In couples, when I work with couples, when they come to see me because a child has died, which has obviously been a big part of my practice, men tend to be restoration oriented, that they tend to want to get on, go back to work, have another child. And women tend to be loss oriented, that they ruminate, they go over, they cry more. And he can be cross with her that she's a kind of wet rag, and she can be cross with him because she thinks he doesn't feel anything and he's cold-hearted and doesn't care. And what I do with them as a couple is I encourage her to help him to do some of the loss work, and him to help her be restorative, to have hope for the future. Hope is the alchemy that turns a life around. We all need hope.
So parents, and there'll be some listening to this, and by the way, it's fine not to use your own name on questions. Do parents ever get over the loss of a child? And why does it seem to lead on too many times to parents separating the loss of a child?
I think with all grief, I don't know if that term getting over it is true anymore. I think what people talk about is that we learn to live with it or accommodate it. I think the devastation of the death of a child is that it's the reverse of nature, that it tears up the rule book of life, that you should never bury your own child. And so it goes to the core of you as a human being, that you have to rebuild everything that you trusted or believed in before, of life being safe, of purpose, of how can you go forward. And that takes an enormous amount of work. But the extraordinary thing is people have an incredible capacity to rebuild their lives. And certainly in my experience, I mean, the research, I haven't seen it recently. The research is that, I mean, what is it? 50% of couples separate anyway. I don't know now that the research shows that if you have a child that dies, that it increases that more. But it is an enormous pressure on the relationship. But it's also something that binds you as a couple, because only really you two can know what it's like. So it's both. I mean, it's incredibly complex. It takes a long time, but I've witnessed many, many times people rebuilding their lives with enormous courage through enormous pain, but they do.
Richard asks, my wife of 18 years, who died 6 years ago this very week, is more present in my head than she ever was alive. Is it okay to be okay with this?
I think it's absolutely okay. And of course, she'd be particularly alive at the anniversary of her death. But yes, we have an incredible imagination, and use your imagination to work for you. I think that's I wouldn't stop yourself doing that at all. My question would be, is it blocking you having relationships with other people? That would be the risk.
And an anonymous question here, how can one stop, as somebody who's been bereaved, from becoming a broken record to people around one? And should one try to stop oneself? Do you understand the question?
I do understand the question. Is that you're ruminating in your head and the same thing goes over, and maybe it's questions. Most people, when they become a broken record, is because they're asking questions: what, why, what if only. And I think there are plenty of things that you can do that can support you. One is journaling. I think writing what you feel is as effective as talking to other people. There's a sort of cognitive behavioral thing that you can do if you feel yourself going over and over the same thing. What I talk about is switch the channel. So you have this question or this rumination that's going on in your head, and you see it as if it's on a television screen in your mind, and then you take a breath and you sort of switch the channel in your mind, and you put on it an image that's an image that brings you a sense of peace or happiness, a view that you've seen or a place that you love. And then you take a breath, and then you step into the present and do that before you're seeing friends. But also have a particular time when you're talking to friends. So I think walking and talking is the most effective way of being with friends and talking about grief, because you're not eyeballing each other. You can get in the rhythm of moving together, you're outside, you can have times of quiet. So really talk meaningfully and properly about what's going on in you with a friend, and that can free you then to put it to one side and consciously choose to put it one side, so you can put your attention intentionally to being with the other people in the room, so you can give yourself a break as well as your friends, because you need to give yourself a break too, because you can drive yourself mad.
And Cherry, thank you for that, Julia. I'm conscious of the time that asks about bereavement for parents. You have 28 statutory sick pay when your child dies. I didn't know if that's true or not. Should we have badges of official mourning for those who are, or ribbons or signs to help those who are grieving so painfully?
I think that's I mean, all the questions have been so open and honest, and I really appreciate them. I've always thought to go back to the Victorian habit of wearing a black armband, whether you're a woman or a man, or a black ribbon. So I've often thought, you know, if you're on the tube and you've been pushed around, if you had a little black ribbon, or if you're in a supermarket and you've forgotten your money, because often when you're grieving you don't remember things, it would really help you. And I've talked to lots of companies and organizations to try and get that off the ground, and I've never succeeded. But I think it, and you can put it in your pocket when you don't want to, but it just tells people I'm a bit vulnerable. It's like I've got 5 layers of skin missing. Just be a bit nicer to me, please be a bit gentler to me.
So that sounds like a bit of a thumbs up for Cherry. Yes. It's also the University of Buckingham creative writing leader. How does creative writing, you talked about it there, expressing yourself, how can you stop that becoming something that then just becomes, you know, we think of Victoria, who couldn't let go of her grief for Albert. When does grieving become obsessive?
Well, the sort of the medical model is that the difference between complicated grief, which is kind of stuck grief like Queen Victoria's, to normal processing grief, which is most people's grief, 10% of people have complex grief, is that after 6 months, you still feel the pain. But if after 6 months, you're still obsessing you in a kind of very intense way, that is a signal that, and you don't want to feel any better. You feel kind of locked in the loss, and so when people come and see me, they want to feel the pain, but they also want to feel okay. They have this pull for both. And complex grief is you don't want to be okay. You want to stay in the place that you are. And often it's to do with the circumstances of the death. So it might be a traumatic death. It could be to do with the relationship with the person that died or how they died. And and your psychological frame before they died. You know, if you have somebody that has already a lot of pre-existing psychological issues, you're more vulnerable to it. But there are particular things that you can do to support you, but you would definitely need to get professional help. That you can't do by talking to friends and family.
Michael asks, and I realise we're dancing around a bit on the questions, says, how can we promote being open in schools so that it's not seen as a sign of weakness to talk about grief inside or other worries? How can we change this instead of just shoveling it under the carpet?
Well, I mean, Anthony knows far more about how to do this in schools than I do. But with Child Bereavement UK, for instance, we have a whole set of lessons that teachers can do with schools. There's one that's called the Elephant's Tea Party, which is talking about suicide in schools, actually. So you know, my understanding with children is, and I think that's where you're coming from, is that children need to be prepared for life, for all aspects of life. And certainly around death and grief, they need the same truth as the adults around them, because what children don't know, they make up. And what they make up is much more frightening than the truth and is much more likely to do them harm. So the more they're given a kind of proper understanding of that what they feel is normal, that they need to have a narrative to know what happened, a beginning, a middle and an end of someone's death, that they are included, that they're made to, you know, often in the past more, but still sometimes now children are often hidden away. You know, they're taken off by the aunt if someone dies. They don't go to the funeral. They aren't part of any of the rituals to do with death. And then they feel like they didn't matter, and they can be very angry later in life that they weren't included. Say their parent died and they didn't go to the funeral.
Is it better to clear all the clothes away and all the possessions? And when is the right time to go through those? Is there a right time?
I think it's incredibly individual. I'd be very wary of doing it too soon, because you need the touchstones to memory, the smell of the clothes, the memory that the clothes bring. And I think as a family, you know, the whole family system is disrupted when someone significant in the family dies. And it's like, one of the ways of thinking about it is that if you have a model above a bed and you take a piece of the mobile off, the whole mobile is tilted. And so as a family system, you have to have a lot of open communication and conversations and times to recalibrate how you are with each other, how you recognize the person that was so significant in your family has died. And then over time, I think there can be a kind of natural decision that, you know, shall we move mum's clothes now or dad's clothes? But I think, you know, I think always the advice with people, if you're vulnerable, whether someone's died or something, you've got divorced or anything big has happened, is to give yourself time before you make very significant decisions.
Such great advice. John says, a different tack again, a few people consider someone taking their own life is an easy option or selfish. Is this the case? And if not, how do you educate people to think differently about suicide?
Gosh.
No easy questions here.
I mean, I've worked a lot with suicide. It's so complex, suicide. One of the ways that I talk to families who are bereaved by suicide is because they have this feeling that they either want to sort of kill the person that's killed themselves, or they feel so guilty. All the what ifs are incredibly tortuous with suicide. You know, if I'd spoken to him, if I'd done this, if I'd done that. And one of the ways of thinking about suicide is that it's like a heart attack of the brain, that, you know, a young man can be walking down the street and suddenly can have a heart attack, like all the wiring in his heart goes offline and he has an attack. And you can have that idea with neurotransmitters in your brain. I mean, a third of suicides are completely unexpected and out of the blue. The other 2/3 are less so. And, you know, I'm a psychotherapist, so I'm completely biased. I think the more we talk about these unspeakable conversations, the more agency we have about trying to prevent them and protect people from suicide. I think a lot of suicide is people who are not able to deal with their feelings. And, you know, when I've worked with people who are suicidal, who don't actually kill themselves, what they say to me is that the pain was so great, but also everybody disappeared. I felt that they'd be better without me. And so that means their lines of connection and communication with these incredibly important people in their life had completely eroded in some way. And with themselves, and the sort of self-loathing is so awful. But it's a difficult thing, suicide. I've said very little, but it's the tip of the iceberg.
What can we do, Julia, to try and make the most of life when we have each other? Why is it that it seems that we value each other most fully when we're no longer there? How can we get that same sense of lived joy in the company of the person while they are with us? Do you follow the question?
I completely follow the question. I think it's a very good question. I mean, I think it's obviously the ideal is to live in the day and live in the moment and be grateful for what you do have. And I think part of what helps you really value and treasure the people in front of you and beside you is recognizing that you're mortal. I think the more we deny our death and their death, the more we kind of take people for granted, get on with our lives, and don't appreciate that it can stop tomorrow. And I think something about COVID is that we've recognized our mortality in a way that we've kind of thought, you know, we think science and technology, the minute you're ill, that you go through the hospital doors and doctors are going to make you better. And I think what COVID has done is taught us all that there are things beyond our control and that we are mortal. And as well as much as that's been frightening, I hope it's meant that people really treasure what they do have. I mean, the best research on that, I'm sure you know, Anthony, is the 75-year Harvard study, which showed that all these thousands of people, it was men to begin with, but who they were followed for 75 years. And that when they look back on their lives, what mattered to them most was their love and connection to others. It wasn't that they made great fortunes. It wasn't that they became famous or were brilliant at their career. And the sort of elixir to life, that research shows, is love. And that people who are in loving, reliable, good relationships, and that doesn't have to be partners and marriage, that you have good friendship relationships, you have a lot of connection in your life, they were also had more joy and more success and less mental illness. They lived longer, they suffered pain less when they were old, and their memory was better when they were old. So that is the big predictor of our kind of outcome, is connection to others. So, and that means that we have to give it time. You can't have good relationships by skating home at 10 o'clock at night, having worked and been famous or doing whatever you thought was more important. Relationships require intention and time and effort, like all the things that matter. And so if you value them, you have to choose them over other things. I sound like a headmistress, don't I?
No, you sound like a very, very wise person indeed. And Julia, there'll be many hundreds of people tonight who've been touched. We're going to come to an end, but touched by, moved by what you've said. What organisation or follow-up could you just point them to for further information? So
there's my website, www.juliasamuel.co.uk. And on that, there are links to lots of organisations, bereavement organisations. The one I'm most involved with is Child Bereavement UK, which supports families when a child dies or a child is bereaved. If you're bereaved of an adult, Cruise is very good. Compassionate Friends. So, but all of those are on my website under What Helps. So do go there to get support for yourself and take care of yourselves.
There'll be a lot of people clicking in and following that up over the next few days, and indeed reading your books and other writing, Julia, and very best wishes from all of us with your next book when you're out walking, cycling, and and we're looking forward to that very much indeed. And just very briefly, tomorrow night we're into philosophy and how do we think? Why do we think what we think? Julian Baggini. And then on Thursday night, another kind of breakdown, the economic breakdown with Paul Johnson of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Julia, goodness, I feel I've aged and grown a lot and changed a lot in the last hour listening to the power of your words and how incredibly appropriate that, like Thornton Wilder, you come down on love and as the most important thing there in all great literature and the world's religions, and to live life and to make the most of it is one of many things that I'm sure we'll take away. It's been a fantastic privilege and honour to have you, Julia. Thank you very, very much indeed for coming on.
Well, thank you, Anthony. You've asked me such good and difficult and challenging, but really interesting and thoughtful questions, and I feel very honoured to be invited by you to be in conversation with you. And I hope that even if people just take one thing away from it, I hope it's helpful to the people that are listening, and I hope you take care of yourselves this evening.
Thank you, Julia.